Some mornings so you wake up believing your hardest days are behind you. For Claire Matthews, 57 years old and finally breathing after decades of struggle, that morning couldn't have been more wrong. She had raised 2 children alone, worked herself to the bone at 2 jobs, and watched her mother slip away all while telling herself that surviving was enough. Now, walking the familiar forest trails near her childhood home, she thought she had found peace in the quiet rhythm of her footsteps on the worn path. That's when she saw it, a rusted metal chest, half buried under years of fallen leaves. Something made her kneel down and brush away the dirt. When she saw the carved initials on the lid, her heart stopped. They belonged to her father, the man who had abandoned her. Family 50 years ago. Inside that chest was something that would change everything she thought she knew about her life. What was her father hiding in those woods all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Claire's hands trembled as she stared at the initials carved deep into the weathered metal. R.M. Robert Matthews. Her father's name etched in a boy's uncertain hand, probably when he was no older than her grandson Tommy was now. The chest felt heavier than it should have, weighed down by decades of rain, snow, and secrets. 20 years had passed since her mother died, taking with her the bitter silence that had defined their household after Robert Matthews walked out that February morning in 1974. Claire had been 7 then, old enough to remember the sound of the front door closing for the last time, but too young to understand why her mother's face had turned to stone whenever his name was mentioned. The years that followed had been a masterclass in survival. Her mother, Patricia, had worked double shifts at the textile factory, her calloused hands speaking of sacrifices that words never could. Claire learned early that crying didn't bring fathers back, that bills needed paying regardless of broken hearts, and that some wounds never heal. They just get covered over with layers of necessity and time. At 17, Claire had married Danny Chun, thinking love could fill the father-shaped hole in her chest. It couldn't. By 37, she was divorced with 2 children, Emma, 15, and Jake, 12, and the cycle of single motherhood had begun anew. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had become exactly what her mother had been, a woman abandoned by a man, left to raise children who would grow up with questions she couldn't answer. The forest had always been her sanctuary. These trails, winding through Douglas fir and cedar, had witnessed every stage of her grief. She had walked here as a heartbroken child, a confused teenager, a desperate young mother, and finally, as a woman learning to find peace in solitude. The trees had grown taller, their canopy thicker, but the path remained constant a ribbon of packed earth that seemed to understand the weight of her footsteps. Now, at 57, Claire thought she had finally reached the other side of struggle. Emma was 32, a nurse practitioner with 2 children of her own. Jake, 29, worked as an electrician and had just bought his first house. Her mother had been gone 2 years, the last threads of obligation finally cut. For the first time in her adult life, Claire could think about what she wanted rather than what was needed. She had quit her evening job at the grocery store last month. The morning shift at the diner would be enough. Now her needs were simple, her wants even simpler. The small apartment she rented near downtown was finally hers alone. Number sick mother in the spare bedroom. No grown children stopping by for money or advice every week. She had begun to imagine a different kind of life, one measured in quiet mornings and books read without interruption. But this chest, this impossible, rust-eaten time capsule threatened to unravel every story she had told herself about her family. Claire's knees protested as she knelt in the damp earth, her hiking boots sinking slightly into the forest floor. October had painted the leaves in shades of amber and gold, and they crunched beneath her as she positioned herself in front of the chest. The metal was cold under her palms, corroded but intact. A simple padlock, green with age, held it closed. She fumbled in her jacket pocket for the multi-tool Emma had given her last Christmas, a practical gift from a practical daughter who had learned self-reliance the hard way. The lock was so corroded that it crumbled at the first touch of the metal file. Claire wondered if her father had intended it to be found someday. If he had chosen a lock, the time itself would eventually break. The lid opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the quiet forest. Inside, wrapped in what had once been a blue wool blanket, were the remnants of a life she had never known existed. A leather wallet, cracked and worn, but still intact. A bundle of letters tied with string that had somehow survived the moisture. A collection of photographs, their edges curled, but their images still visible. And at the bottom, nestled in a small wooden box that had escaped the worst of the elements, a silver locket on a delicate chain. Claire lifted the wallet first, her fingers tracing the familiar texture of leather her father had once touched. Inside, behind a clouded plastic window, was his driver's license, expired in 1976, 2 years after he had left them. 2 years he had remained in Oregon, close enough to drive past their house, close enough to watch his daughter grow up from, a distance he had chosen to maintain. The photographs made her breath catch. There was one of her mother, young and laughing, holding a baby Claire didn't recognize. Another showed her father in work clothes, standing beside a mill she had never seen. But it was the wallet-sized school photo that made her sink back onto, her heels in shock. It was her own second-grade picture, the one taken just months after he had left. Somehow, he had gotten a copy. The letters were tied with kitchen twine, the kind her mother had used for everything from hanging laundry to tying up newspapers. Claire's hands shook as she untied the knot, careful not to damage what might be the only record of her father's thoughts. The paper was yellowed and soft, but the ink had held. The first letter was addressed to someone named Margaret, dated March 1974, just weeks after he had left their house. The handwriting was her father's, the careful script she remembered from grocery lists and birthday cards that had stopped coming so suddenly. "My dearest M," it began, "I know you think I should tell Patricia about us, but you don't understand what it would do to Claire. She's already so confused, asking why Daddy doesn't live here anymore. How can I tell her there's another little girl who calls me Daddy too?" Claire's vision blurred. She set the letter aside, her mind reeling. Another little girl. Her father hadn't just abandoned them. He had chosen someone else, another family, another daughter. The sound of footsteps on the trail made her look up. Mrs. Henderson, her elderly neighbor from childhood, was walking her ancient golden retriever, both moving with the careful deliberation of age. Claire quickly gathered the items back into the chest, her movements clumsy with shock. "Claire, dear, are you all right?" Mrs. Henderson called out, her voice carrying the concern of someone who had known Claire since she was in pigtails. "You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way, she had. Claire forced a smile, standing up and brushing dirt from her knees. "Just taking a rest, Mrs. Henderson. Beautiful morning for a walk." The older woman nodded, but her sharp eyes took in the disturbed earth, the metal chest that Claire was now trying to position behind her legs. Grace Henderson had been the neighborhood watch before such things had names, the kind of woman who noticed when mail piled up and when gardens went untended. "That's an interesting find," she said carefully. "Looks old." "Just some old camping gear someone left behind," Claire lied, hating the words as they left her mouth. She had always been a terrible liar, a trait her mother had said came from her. Father Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly, but there was something in her expression that suggested she wasn't fooled. "Well, you be careful with old things, dear. Sometimes they're buried for good reasons." She tugged gently on her dog's leash. "Come on, Rusty. Let's let Claire enjoy her walk." As they disappeared around the bend, Claire sank back down beside. The chest. Mrs. Henderson's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes they're buried for good reasons. Maybe her father had buried this chest, not as a treasure to be found, but as a burden to be forgotten. She looked again at the letter in her hands, at the careful way her father had formed each word. Another little girl who calls me daddy, too. The pain was fresh, as sharp as if he had just spoken the words to her face. For 50 years, Claire had carried the story of abandonment, had shaped her understanding of herself around the fact that her father had simply chosen to leave. It had made her strong, self-reliant, determined never to depend on anyone who might walk away. But if he hadn't just left, if he had left for someone else, chosen another daughter over her, then what did that make her? The forest around her seemed to pulse with questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. The chest sat open like a mouth, waiting to reveal more secrets, more truths that would rewrite everything she thought she knew about her family. Claire gathered the letters, photographs, and wallet, wrapping them carefully back in the remnants of the blue blanket. She would take them home, to the safety of her small apartment, where she could process this discovery away from the watchful eyes of neighbors and the whispered conversations of small-town speculation. But as she lifted the chest, preparing to carry it back to her car, she knew there was no going back to the peace she had found in not knowing. The questions that had been buried with these objects were now alive in her mind, demanding answers that might be more painful than the silence they would replace. Some treasures, she was beginning to understand, came with a price that was higher than gold. Claire's kitchen table had never felt so small. The bundle of letters lay spread before her like tarot cards promising futures she wasn't sure she wanted to see. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but she couldn't bring herself to get up for a fresh cup. Each letter she read rewrote another piece of her history, and she wasn't sure how many revisions her understanding could withstand. The second letter was dated April 1974, 2 months after her father had left. The paper was soft with age, and she handled it like it might crumble at her touch. "My Patricia found one of your letters." She didn't say anything, but I could see it in her eyes at breakfast. The way she looked at Claire was different, like she was seeing your daughter instead of mine. "I can't do this to them anymore. I have to choose, and I've made my choice. Please understand that this doesn't mean I love you and David any less. It just means I can't keep breaking 2 families apart when I should be holding one together." David. The name hit her like a physical blow. Her father had written about David the way he should have written about her, with love, with the protective instinct of a parent. And her mother had known. Patricia Matthews, who had spent 50 years letting her daughter believe her father was simply a man who walked away from responsibility, had known about the other woman, the other child. Claire's hand shook as she reached for the third letter, dated July 1974. "Dearest Margaret, I saw you at the farmer's market yesterday with David. He's grown so much, and he has your eyes but my stubborn chin. It took everything I had not to run to you both." Claire starts 2nd grade in the fall, and she asked me in her last letter if I'm ever coming home. I told her Daddy has to work far away for a while, but someday we'll go fishing again. The lies are eating me alive. I've taken a job at the Morrison Mill, far enough away that I won't accidentally run into Patricia in town, close enough that I can send money to both families. It's not fair to either of you, but it's the best I can do. The Morrison Mill. Claire remembered that name from her childhood, remembered her mother's friends mentioning men who worked there, but it was on the other side of the county, a 40-minute drive from their house. But her father had made it sound like another world. She rifled through the remaining letters, her eyes scanning for dates, for names, for any clue that would help her understand the timeline of her father's secret life. There were 12 letters in total, spanning from March 1974 to December 1976. The last one was different from the others, shorter, more desperate. "Margaret, I can't keep living like this. The mill is closing after New Year's, and I've been offered work in Montana. Real work with a future. I want you and David to come with me. I know I'm asking you to leave everything, but I can't go on pretending to be half a father to two children who both deserve all of me. I've buried something for Claire in the woods near Miller's Creek, near the big oak where we used to take her when she was small. If she ever comes looking for answers, she'll find what I couldn't give her in person. Please think about Montana. We could start fresh, all three of us. David could have a father who doesn't have to hide his love. Claire stared at the letter until the words blurred. December 1976. She would have been 9 years old then. Old enough to understand that her father wasn't coming back, but still young enough to hope. Had her mother known about this final offer? Had she known that Robert Matthews had chosen his second family over his first? The phone rang, startling her back to the present. Emma's name appeared on the caller ID, and Claire hesitated before answering. Her daughter had always been perceptive, always able to read the subtle changes in Claire's voice that indicated trouble. "Hi, honey," Claire said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mom, you sound weird. What's wrong?" There was no point in lying to Emma. Even as a child, she had possessed an uncanny ability to detect when adults were keeping secrets. It was a skill honed by years of watching her mother struggle to keep their small family afloat, of learning to read the signs that indicated whether they would have money for extras that month. "I found something today," Claire said carefully. "Something that belonged to your grandfather." Emma's interest was immediate and sharp. Unlike Jake, who had never shown much curiosity about family history, Emma had always asked questions about the grandfather she had never met. When she was younger, she had created elaborate fantasies about where he might have gone, what important mission might have called him away from them, what kind of something. Claire looked down at the letters scattered across her table. Letters to a woman named Margaret. "Emma, I think your grandfather had another family." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Claire wondered if the call had dropped. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled in the way it got when she was processing difficult information. "Another family as in another woman and another child. A son named David." Claire picked up the photograph she had found in the wallet, the one of her father with the unknown woman and small boy. "I have a picture of them together." "Jesus, Mom." Emma's nurse training had taught her to remain calm in crisis situations, but Claire could hear the shock beneath her professional composure. "Are you okay? I mean, how are you handling this?" Claire laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not sure yet. I keep thinking about your grandmother, about how angry she was for so many years. I always thought she was bitter because Dad just left, but she knew, Emma. She knew about them. What are you going to do?" It was the question Claire had been avoiding since she first opened that chest. What was she going to do? She could rebury the letters, pretend she had never found them, go back to her quiet life, and let the dead keep their secrets. Or she could follow the thread her father had left behind, pursue answers that might be more painful than the questions. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to leave it alone. What good can come from digging up a 50-year-old affair?" "But," Claire smiled despite herself. Emma had always been able to hear the unspoken, but in any statement. "But I keep thinking about this other son, this David. He'd be in his 40s now. Maybe he has questions too. Maybe he spent his whole life wondering about the father who chose his first family over his second. Or maybe he thinks his father was a single man who died young," Emma pointed out. "Mom, you could be opening a can of worms that hurts a lot of people." "I know." Claire folded the last letter carefully, placing it back with the others. "But I also keep thinking about what it would have meant to me, growing up, to know that Dad didn't just abandon us, that he was torn between two families he loved instead of just walking away from one he didn't." Emma was quiet for a moment, and Claire could almost hear her daughter's analytical mind working through the implications. "Do you want me to come over? I could drive down tonight after I get off work." The offer was tempting. Emma's presence had always been a comfort. Her practical nature balanced Claire's tendency toward emotional decision-making. But this felt like something Claire needed to work through on her own, at least initially. "Not tonight, honey, but maybe this weekend? I might have more information by then." More information how? Claire looked at the address she had copied from one of the letters, the return address that had appeared on several envelopes. "I'm going to try to find Margaret." "Mom, I know it's crazy, but Emma, these letters, they paint a picture of a man who is trying to do right by everyone and failing. I need to know if that's true, or if I'm just making excuses for him because it's easier than accepting that he chose someone else over us." Emma sighed, and Claire could picture her rubbing her temples the way she did when she was trying to solve a particularly difficult problem. "Promise me you'll be careful. And promise me you'll call me before you do anything crazy." Define crazy. "Mom." "I promise," Claire said, and meant it. "I'll be careful, and I'll keep you informed." After they hung up, Claire gathered the letters into a neat stack and placed them back in the blue blanket. The wallet and photographs she set aside. She wanted to study them more carefully, to see if she could glean any additional information from the details captured in faded ink and aging. Film. Her father's driver's license showed an address she didn't recognize, somewhere on the south side of town. The neighborhood had been torn down years ago to make way for a shopping center, but Claire remembered it as a place where mill workers had lived in small houses with chain-link fences and vegetable gardens. One of the photographs showed her father and the woman Margaret standing in front of what looked like a modest home with white siding and a front porch. A small boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, sat on the porch steps with a dog that looked like a border collie mix. Everyone in the picture was smiling, and there was an ease to their poses that spoke of family, of belonging. Claire tried to imagine her father in that scene, tried to picture him coming home from work to this other house, this other family. Did he help the boy with homework? Did he and Margaret sit on that porch in the evenings, planning a future that would never include Claire and her mother? The hardest part wasn't imagining her father's happiness with his second family. The hardest part was realizing that she couldn't entirely blame him for it. If he had been 19 when Claire was born, and she calculated that he must have been, based on what she remembered of her parents' ages, then he had been barely more than a child himself when he became a father. Maybe Margaret had been the love he had always wanted, and Claire's mother had been the obligation he had learned to accept. The thought was disloyal to her mother's memory, but Claire couldn't shake it. Patricia Matthews had been a hard woman, made harder by circumstances and disappointment. She had loved Claire in her way, but it had been a fierce, protective love that left little room for softness or spontaneity. Maybe Robert Matthews had simply been looking for a place where he could breathe. Claire looked at the clock. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon, and she was supposed to work the dinner shift at the diner. But the thought of making small talk with customers, of pretending that her world hadn't tilted off its axis in the space of a morning, felt impossible. She called in sick for the first time in 6 years. Instead, she spread the contents of the chest across her kitchen table and began to piece together the puzzle of her father's hidden life. Every letter, every photograph, every small detail became a clue in a mystery that had been waiting 50 years to be solved. By the time the sun set, Claire had made a decision. Tomorrow, she would begin looking for Margaret Foster. She would find this woman who had shared her father's love, this mother of the half-brother she had never known existed. She would ask the questions that had been buried with that chest, and she would finally learn the truth about the man who had shaped her life by leaving it. The truth might be painful, but it couldn't be worse than 50 years of wondering. ***The Millbrook Public Library had been Claire's refuge during the lean years after her divorce. When money was too tight for entertainment and babysitters were beyond her budget, she had brought Emma and Jake here on Saturday afternoons, letting them lose themselves in picture books while she researched everything from job opportunities to scholarship applications. The building smelled the same as it had 20 years ago: old paper, floor wax, and the faint mustiness that clung to buildings where knowledge accumulated in layers. Mrs. Chen, the head librarian, looked up from her computer terminal as Claire approached the reference desk. Patricia Chen had been a fixture at the library for as long as Claire could remember. One of those ageless women who seemed to have been born knowing exactly where everything belonged and how to find what people didn't even know they were looking for. "Claire Matthews," she said with genuine warmth. "I haven't seen you in ages. How are you doing, dear?" "I'm well, Mrs. Chen. Actually, I was hoping you might be able to help me with some research." Claire shifted the manila folder she carried, feeling suddenly uncertain about her mission. In the bright fluorescent light of the library, her quest to uncover 50-year-old secrets felt both urgent and slightly absurd. "Of course. What are you looking for?" Claire glanced around the reference area, noting the scattered patrons hunched over computers and thick volumes. "I'm trying to find information about someone who lived here in the 1970s. Employment records. Maybe newspaper mentions, anything that might help me track down where they went." Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained professionally neutral. "That's quite a project. Local history research can be tricky, especially for that time period. A lot of records weren't digitized, and some were lost when the old courthouse had that fire in 1989. But we do have microfilm archives of the local papers, and I might be able to point you towards some other resources." "Who are you looking for?" "Robert Matthews, my father." The words felt strange in Claire's mouth. She had spoken so rarely about her father over the years that claiming him felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit properly. If Mrs. Chen was surprised by the admission, she didn't show it. Instead, her expression softened with the particular compassion librarians reserve for patrons seeking to piece together family stories. "I see. Well, let's start with what we have here, and then I can suggest some other places you might look." She led Claire to a corner workstation equipped with a microfilm reader that looked like it had been installed sometime during the Carter administration. The machine hummed to life with a sound like a small airplane warming up its engines. "The local paper from that era is our best bet for employment announcements. Social news, that sort of thing," Mrs. Chen explained as she loaded a reel of film. "What years are you most interested in?" 1974 to 1976, primarily." Claire pulled out one of the letters she had found, pointing to the letterhead. "He mentioned working at the Morrison Mill during that time." "Ah, Morrison Mill." Mrs. Chen's face lit up with recognition. "That's a good lead." The mill was one of the largest employers in the county back then. They used to run regular ads in the paper, and they sometimes mentioned new hires or promotions. She adjusted the focus on the machine, and newspaper pages from 1974 flickered into view. "This will take some time to go through. Are you comfortable using the machine?" Claire nodded, though the truth was she felt overwhelmed by the prospect of scrolling through months of old newspapers, looking for traces of a man who had worked so hard to remain invisible. "Mrs. Chen, you wouldn't happen to remember the Morrison Mill, would you? Or anyone who worked there?" The older woman paused in her explanation of the microfilm controls. "Actually, I do remember it quite well. My late husband worked there for a few years in the early 70s, before he got the job at the post office. It was good work when you could get it, but it was also the kind of place where people didn't ask too many questions about each other's personal lives." She gave Claire a meaningful look. If you understand what I mean. Claire understood perfectly. The Morrison Mill had been the kind of workplace where a man could reinvent himself, where Robert Matthews could become just Bob to his coworkers. where no one would inquire too deeply about why he lived alone in a rented room instead of with a family. Is there anyone still around who might remember working with him? Mrs. Chun considered the question carefully. Charlie Brennan might. He was a foreman there for years, and he's got a memory like a steel trap. He's retired now, spends most of his time at the senior center playing cribbage, but he's sharp as ever. I could give you his number if you'd like. The offer felt like a lifeline. That would be wonderful. Thank you. As Mrs. Chun went to fetch Charlie Brennan's contact information, Claire positioned herself in front of the microfilm machine and began the slow process of scrolling through 1974. The pages flashed by in a blur of advertisements for products that no longer existed, political coverage of elections she barely remembered, and social announcements for people whose names meant nothing to her. It was in the April 15th, 1974 edition that she found the first mention of her father. A small item in the business section announced that Morrison Mill had hired several new employees, including Robert Matthews, experienced equipment operator. The entry was just 2 lines long, but seeing her father's name in black and white in the context of this secret life he had built made her chest tight with emotion. She continued scrolling, and in June found a photograph that made her breath catch. It was from the mill's annual safety recognition ceremony, and there, third from the left in the back row, stood her father. He looked younger than she remembered, his hair still thick and dark, wearing the kind of work clothes that spoke of honest labor and steady paychecks. He was smiling, and there was something in his expression, a contentment, maybe even happiness that she had never seen in the few photographs from her childhood. Mrs. Chen returned with a slip of paper bearing Charlie Brennan's phone number, just as Claire found the second photograph. This one was from the following year's company picnic, and it showed groups of employees and their families gathered around picnic tables. Claire scanned the faces carefully, and there, at a table near the edge of the frame, she spotted her father again. This time he wasn't alone. A woman with shoulder-length brown hair sat beside him, and a young boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, was perched on her father's lap. The image was small and slightly blurred, but there was no mistaking the intimacy of the pose. This was Margaret and David, the family her father had chosen to claim publicly while keeping his first family hidden. Find something interesting? Mrs. Chun asked, noting Claire's stillness. Claire pointed to the photograph. That's him, with Margaret and her son. Mrs. Chun adjusted her glasses and leaned closer to the screen. She's lovely, she said simply, and there was no judgment in her voice. Just the observation of someone who had seen enough of life to understand that hearts rarely followed the neat lines that society drew around them. Mrs. Chun, do you think would it be possible to get copies of these pages? I'd like to show them to my daughter. Of course. We can print them right from the machine. She showed Claire how to operate the print function, and soon she had physical copies of the newspaper pages that proved her father had built a life in plain sight, just far enough from his original family to avoid detection. As Claire gathered her copies and prepared to leave, Mrs. Chun touched her arm gently. Claire, I hope you don't mind my saying this, but family history research can sometimes turn up things that are difficult to process. If you need someone to talk through what you're discovering, my door is always open. The kindness in the offer nearly brought Claire to tears. Thank you. I might take you up on that. And Claire, whatever you find out about your father, remember that people are complicated. The man who left your family and the man who worked at Morrison Mill, they were the same person, but that doesn't mean either version of him was the whole truth. Outside the library, Claire sat in her car for several minutes, staring at the copy she had made. The photograph showed a version of her father she had never known existed, relaxed, happy, integrated into a community. It was jarring to reconcile this image with the man who had packed a single suitcase and disappeared from her childhood. She pulled out her phone and dialed Charlie Brennan's number before she could lose her nerve. The voice that answered was gravelly, with age but sharp with curiosity. "Brennan here." "Mr. Brennan, my name is Claire Matthews. Patricia Chun at the library gave me your number. I'm hoping you might remember someone who worked with you at Morrison Mill back in the 70s. There was a pause, and she could hear the sound of a television being muted in the background. "Who you looking for?" "Robert Matthews. He worked there from 1974 to 1976. Maybe 1977? Another pause, longer this time. When Charlie Brennan spoke again, his voice had changed, become more careful. "Bob Matthews. Yeah, I remember Bob. Good worker, kept to himself mostly. Why you asking about him?" "He was my father." The silence stretched so long that Claire wondered if the call had dropped. When Charlie finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "Well, I'll be damned. Little Claire, Bob used to talk about you sometimes, you know. Said you were smart as a whip, always asking questions about how things worked." The unexpected kindness in his voice caught Claire off guard. "He talked about me?" "Course he did. You were his little girl. Look, this isn't really a phone conversation. You know, why don't you come by the senior center tomorrow afternoon? I'll be there playing cards, and we can sit somewhere quiet and talk proper." Claire agreed to meet him the following day, and as she hung up the phone, she realized that she was no longer just looking for information about her father's secret life. She was looking for pieces of herself that she had never known. Existed the version of Claire that had lived in her father's heart even after he had chosen to leave her behind. Asterisk. The Millbrook Senior Center occupied a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, its wraparound porch dotted with rocking chairs and planters full of late-season chrysanthemums. Claire had driven past it countless times over the years, but never had reason to enter. Now, climbing the wooden steps with their peeling paint and worn treads, she felt like she was crossing into a different world, one where the past wasn't buried, but lived on in the memories of people who had witnessed it firsthand. Charlie Brennan was exactly what Claire had expected from his voice. Tall and lean despite his 78 years, with hands that spoke of decades of manual labor and eyes that missed very little. He was waiting for her in the main room, standing beside a card table where 3 other men continued their game of cribbage, occasionally glancing up with the polite curiosity of people whose daily routines rarely included visitors. "You look like him," Charlie said without preamble, extending a work-calloused hand. "Got his jawline and his way of standing. Bob always stood like he was ready for whatever came next, you know?" Claire hadn't known, but something in the observation felt familiar, like recognizing a family trait she had never noticed in herself. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Mr. Brennan." "Charlie, please. And it's no trouble. Been a long time since anyone asked me about the old days at Morrison." He gestured toward a quieter corner of the room where 2 armchairs sat beside a window overlooking the center's small garden. "Let's sit somewhere we can talk without the boys listening in. They're good fellows, but they love gossip more than old women." As they settled into the worn upholstery, Claire pulled out the folder containing the newspaper copies and the photograph from her father's wallet. She had spent the morning preparing for this conversation, trying to anticipate what questions to ask. But now that she was here, facing someone who had actually known her father as an adult, the words felt inadequate. "I found some things," she began, showing him the company picnic photograph. "Letters, pictures. I'm trying to understand what his life was like after he left us." Charlie studied the photograph with the careful attention of someone sorting through decades of memories. This was taken at the 1975 picnic, I think. Out at Miller's Park. Bob brought Margaret and the boy David, wasn't it? Nice family. Margaret was a sweet woman, worked at the phone company. David was a good kid, maybe a little shy, but he thought the world of Bob. The casual way Charlie spoke about them as if Margaret and David were simply another family among many he had known made Claire's throat tight. How long did you know about them? About Margaret and David? Bob introduced them to everyone pretty much right away. Never made any secret of them at work. Charlie paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. But I knew Bob had another family too. A wife and daughter somewhere. He never talked about you much, but sometimes he'd let things slip. Like when David lost his first tooth, Bob mentioned that his other little girl had been about the same age when she lost hers. Claire stared at the photograph, trying to process the idea that her father had carried pieces of her life into his new one, that David's milestones had reminded him of her own. Did he ever say why he left? Why he didn't just? She stopped, realizing she didn't know how to finish the question. Why? He didn't just get divorced and start fresh. Charlie's voice was gentle but direct. I wondered about that myself. Bob wasn't the kind of man to do things the easy way. I'll give him that. He used to say he'd made promises to 2 women, and breaking one promise didn't make the other one stronger. The words hit Claire like a physical blow. Her father had seen his obligations to both families as equally binding, equally sacred. It wasn't that he had chosen Margaret over Patricia and Claire. It was that he couldn't choose at all. He sent money, Charlie continued, to both families. I know because he used to cash his paychecks here and then buy money orders. Always 2 of them, always the same amounts. It left him pretty thin sometimes, but he never complained. Claire thought about her mother's bitter pride, the way Patricia had refused any form of charity or assistance even during the leanest months. My mother never mentioned receiving money from him. Maybe she didn't know it was from him. Bob was clever about things like that. Might have sent it through a lawyer or made it look like it came from somewhere else. Your mother strike you as the type to accept help from a man who'd left her. The question was rhetorical, but Claire shook her head anyway. Patricia Matthews would have burned money before accepting it from the husband who had abandoned her, especially if she had known about it. Margaret and David. Charlie reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I've been carrying this around since Pat Chung called me yesterday. It's Bob's employment record, well, a copy of it anyway. Thought you might want to see it. The document was official looking, with the Morrison Mill letterhead and several stamps indicating its authenticity. Under emergency contact, 2 names were listed. Patricia Matthews with Claire's childhood address and Margaret Foster with an address on Maple Street. Margaret Foster, Claire read aloud. So they weren't married? Nope, but they might as well have been, the way they acted. Bob was planning to marry her, though. I know because he asked me about rings once. Wanted to know where I'd gotten my wife's wedding band. This was maybe 6 months before the mill closed. Claire studied the address listed for Margaret Foster. Maple Street was in the older part of town, not far from where she lived now. If Margaret was still alive, still in the area, she might be closer than Claire had imagined. Charlie, what happened when the mill closed? Do you know where they went? The old man's expression grew sad. That's where the story gets complicated. The mill closure wasn't announced until December of 1976, but there had been rumors for months. Jobs were getting scarce, and Bob had been offered work in Montana, good work, with a mining company. He was torn up about it because it meant leaving everything behind, but it also meant he could finally stop living a double life. Did they go to Montana? Charlie was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the garden where someone had planted winter vegetables in neat rows. I don't know. The mill closed right after New Year's, and Bob was gone by then. But I heard, and this is just talk. You understand, I heard that Margaret didn't go with him. What do you mean? I mean, I heard she stayed. Word was that Bob left for Montana alone, and Margaret remained here with David, but I can't say for certain. People say a lot of things, and half of it's wrong. Claire felt something cold settle in her chest. If Margaret had stayed in Millbrook, if she and David had remained in the area all these years, then Claire's father had left everyone behind. Not just his first family, but his second one too. Charlie, is there any chance Margaret is still here? Still in town? Could be. She'd be in her 70s now, but that's not old by today's standards. And David would be, close to 50. If they stayed, they're probably still around. This isn't the kind of place people move away from unless they have to. Claire stared at the employment record, at Margaret Foster's address from nearly 50 years ago. It was a starting point, a thread she could follow. But it was also a doorway to conversations that might hurt people who had built lives around their own version of Robert Matthews' story. Charlie, can I ask you something personal? What did you think of my father? As a man, I mean. The question seemed to surprise him, and he took his time answering. Bob was a good man caught in a bad situation. He worked hard, treated people fairly, never caused trouble. But he was carrying a weight that would have crushed most people. You could see it in his face sometimes, especially toward the end. Like he was trying to hold up two houses with his bare hands and watching them both fall down anyway. Do you think he was happy with Margaret and David? I think he loved them. I think he loved you and your mother too. The problem with Bob was that he loved too much, not too little. He couldn't figure out how to be a whole person for anyone because he was trying to be everything to everyone. Claire folded the employment record carefully and placed it back in her folder. Thank you for this. For talking to me about him. You planning to look for Margaret? The question hung in the air between them. Claire knew that this was the moment of decision, the point where she either committed to following this path to its conclusion or chose to leave the past undisturbed. I think I have to, she said finally. I need to know what happened to them. And I think they might want to know what happened to us too. Charlie nodded slowly. Just remember what I told you about Bob carrying too much weight. Sometimes the truth is heavy, and sharing it just spreads the burden around. Make sure you're ready for that before you go knocking on doors. As Claire left the senior center, she felt the weight Charlie had mentioned settling on her own shoulders. She was no longer just seeking answers about her father's disappearance. She was preparing to enter the lives of people who might have spent 50 years building their own understanding of what Robert Matthews had meant to them. The address on Maple Street was less than 10 minutes away. She could drive there now, see if the house still stood, maybe even ring the doorbell and ask if anyone remembered Margaret Foster. But something held her back, a recognition that once she took that step, there would be no returning to the comfortable distance of historical research. Instead, she drove home. Margaret Foster's address burning in her pocket like a secret. She wasn't sure she was ready to share. 3 days passed before Claire found the courage to drive down Maple Street. She had spent those days in a strange limbo, going through them, motions of her normal routine, while her mind circled endlessly around the decision she knew she had to make. The morning shift at the diner felt surreal, as if she were watching someone else pour coffee and take orders while she stood apart, holding secrets that changed everything about who she thought she was. Emma had called twice, each time pressing gently for updates on her research. Claire had told her about Charlie Brennan and the employment records, but she hadn't mentioned the address burning a hole in her jacket pocket. Some instinct warned her that once she spoke Margaret Foster's current whereabouts aloud, the decision would be made for her. On Thursday morning, after a restless night spent staring at the ceiling, Claire finally admitted to herself what she had known since leaving the senior center. She couldn't move forward without answers, and she couldn't get answers without taking risks. Maple Street ran parallel to the old downtown district, lined with modest houses that had been built in the 1940s and 1950s for returning veterans and their growing families. The trees were mature enough to form a canopy over the street, and most of the properties showed the careful maintenance of long-time owners. Fresh paint, tidy gardens, mailboxes that actually matched the houses. Number 247 was a small white bungalow, with blue shutters and a front porch that had been enclosed with screens sometime in the last decade. The yard was neat but not fussy, with the kind of landscaping that favored practical plants over showpieces. A late-model sedan sat in the driveway, and newspapers lay neatly stacked on the porch table, suggesting someone still lived here regularly. Claire parked across the street and sat in her car for 10 minutes, watching the house for signs of life. What would she say if Margaret Foster answered the door? How did one begin a conversation about a shared past that one party didn't know existed? A curtain moved in the front window, and Claire realized she was being observed in return. The thought of being seen as some kind of suspicious character lurking outside someone's home finally motivated her to get out of the car. The front door opened before she reached the porch steps. The woman standing in the doorway was in her early 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and the kind of direct gaze that comes from a lifetime of facing problems head-on. She wore jeans and a cardigan that had seen better days, and there was something immediately familiar about her bearing, a straightforward practicality that reminded Claire of her own mother. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her tone polite but cautious. Claire's carefully rehearsed introduction evaporated. Instead, she found herself studying the woman's face, looking for traces of the young Margaret from her father's photographs. The bone structure was the same, and the eyes brown with flecks of gold were definitely familiar. "Are you Margaret Foster?" she asked out. The woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. "I was a long time ago. Been Margaret Harrison for 32 years now." "Who's asking?" The name hit Claire like a physical blow. Margaret had remarried, had built a life that moved beyond Robert Matthews. Somehow, this possibility had never occurred to Claire. She had imagined Margaret frozen in time, waiting for a man who had never come back. "My name is Claire Matthews," she said, watching carefully for any sign of recognition. "Robert Matthews was my father." Margaret's face went completely still. For a moment, Claire thought the older woman might close the door, might retreat back into the safety of whatever story she had told herself about Bob Matthews and his first family. Instead, Margaret opened the door wider. "You'd better come in," she said quietly. The inside of the house was comfortable without being fancy, decorated with the accumulated treasures of someone who valued memories over fashion. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, and Claire found herself scanning them quickly, looking for any trace of her father or the young boy from the mill picnic. Margaret gestured toward a pair of armchairs, arranged near the front window. "Sit, please. Can I get you coffee? Tea?" "Coffee would be nice," Claire said, though she wasn't sure she could swallow anything past the tightness in her throat. As Margaret moved around the small kitchen that opened into the living room, Claire had a chance to study her more carefully. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing a household, and there was a calmness to her demeanor that spoke of having weathered whatever storms life had thrown at her. "You look like him," Margaret said as she returned, with 2 steaming mugs. "Not just the physical resemblance, though that's there too, but the way you hold yourself. Bob always looked like he was thinking 3 thoughts at once." The casual way she spoke his name, as if Robert Matthews was still a living presence in her life, made Claire's chest tight. "You remember him well." Margaret settled into the chair across from her, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug as if drawing warmth from it. "Hard to forget a man like Bob. He was—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "He was the kind of person who left an impression. Mrs. Harrison, I found some things. Letters he wrote to you, photographs. I know about David." If Claire had expected shock or defensiveness, she was disappointed. Margaret simply nodded, as if she had been waiting for this conversation for 50 years. I wondered if someone would come looking eventually. Bob always said you were a smart little girl, too curious for your own good. He talked about me. Of course he did. You were his daughter. Margaret's voice carried a gentle rebuke. Just because he wasn't living with you didn't mean he stopped loving you. The words were kind, but they opened a wound Claire hadn't realized was still bleeding. And why did he leave us? If he loved me, why did he just disappear? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if the answers might be floating there among the steam. When she looked up, her eyes were sad but not pitying. Bob didn't disappear, Claire. He was torn apart. There's a difference. I don't understand. Margaret rose and walked to a small desk in the corner of the room. She returned with a manila envelope that looked like it had been handled many times over the years. Maybe this will help you understand. Inside the envelope were more photographs, letters, and what looked like official documents. Margaret spread them on the coffee table between their chairs with the care of someone displaying precious artifacts. Asterisk. Bob came into my life when David was 3 years old. She began. David's biological father had left when I was pregnant, and I was trying to raise him alone while working at the phone company. Bob was like a gift I hadn't expected. Kind, responsible, wonderful with David. We fell in love, and for a while I thought we were going to have a normal life together. She picked up one of the photographs, a candid shot of Bob pushing a young David on a swing set. But Bob carried guilt like other people carry wallets, always there, always weighing him down. He told me about you and your mother from the beginning. Told me he'd made a mistake leaving, but didn't know how to fix it without making things worse. Claire studied the photograph. Her father looked young and happy, but even in the grainy image, she could see something careful in his expression, as if part of him was always holding back. The letters I found, he talked about having to choose. Margaret nodded. He was trying to do right by everyone and failing at it spectacularly. He sent money to your mother, you know, every month through a lawyer in town. He was terrified. She'd refuse it if she knew it came from him, so he made it look like some kind of assistance program. The revelation hit Claire like a physical blow. All those years when money had been tight but never quite desperate, when her mother had somehow managed to keep food on the table and the lights on her father had been there, invisibly supporting them. Why didn't he just come home? If he was still supporting us, still thinking about us, because he was supporting us too. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm, and he couldn't bring himself to hurt either family by choosing. So he tried to be everything to everyone, and it nearly killed him. Claire looked at the documents Margaret had spread on the table. One of them appeared to be a bank statement showing regular money transfers. Another looked like a legal document of some kind. What happened when the mill closed? Margaret's expression grew sad. Bob got an offer to work in Montana. Good money, a fresh start. He wanted David and me to go with him, and for a while, I thought we would. But then, she paused, picking up one of the legal documents. Then I found out something that changed everything. She handed Claire a marriage certificate dated 1957. The names on it were Robert Matthews and Patricia Wells, Claire's mother's maiden name. They were still married, Margaret said quietly. All those years, Bob had never divorced your mother. In the eyes of the law, David and I weren't his family at all. We were just... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Claire stared. The marriage certificate, her mind reeling. You knew? You knew he was still married to my mother. Not until 1976, right before he left for Montana. Bob was trying to get his affairs in order, and he finally told me the truth. He'd never filed for divorce because he'd been afraid. Your mother would refuse to accept his financial support if she thought he was trying to make things official with me. The complexity of her father's deception was staggering. He had been supporting two families while legally bound to neither, loving two women while being honest with none of them. So you didn't go to Montana? Margaret shook her head. How could I? I'd been living as his wife for 2 years, but I wasn't his wife. David had been calling him Daddy, but legally, Bob had no claim to him at all. When Bob left for Montana, he promised he'd get divorced and send for us, but she shrugged, a gesture that carried 50 years of disappointment. People promise a lot of things when they're leaving. Did you ever hear from him again? Margaret was quiet for so long that Claire thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Once, a letter from Montana, maybe 6 months after he left. He said he was working on the divorce, that he'd found a lawyer who could handle things from there. But he also said— She paused, reaching for another envelope. He also said he wasn't sure he deserved to have a family at all, after what he'd put everyone through. Claire took the letter Margaret offered, noting how worn it was, as if it had been read many times. The handwriting was her father's, but it was shakier than the earlier letters, as if written by someone who was sick or under great stress. My dearest Margaret, it began, Montana is beautiful, but it's also the loneliest place on earth when you're missing everyone you love. I've contacted a lawyer about the divorce, but I keep thinking about the damage I've done to all of you. Maybe the kindest thing I can do is disappear completely. Let you all build lives without the confusion I bring. David deserves a father who can be there all the time, not one who's always torn between two worlds. And you deserve a man who can marry you without lawyers and complications and secrets. The letter went on for 2 pages, but the theme remained the same. Robert Matthews convinced himself that leaving everyone behind was an act of love rather than abandonment. He never sent for you, Claire said. It wasn't a question. No, and after a year of waiting, I realized he never would. I met my husband Frank at church. He was a widower with 2 daughters, and he was kind to David. We married in 1978. Claire looked around the room again, this time noting the photographs on the mantel, with fresh eyes. A wedding picture showing Margaret in a simple blue dress standing beside a tall man with a warm smile. School photos showing David growing up alongside 2 girls who must have been Frank's daughters. Family gatherings and graduations and holidays, all. The markers of a life that had moved forward after Robert Matthews chose to disappear from it. David, Claire said. My half-brother. Is he? He's fine. Married. 3 kids of his own. He's a teacher at the high school, actually. Good man. Like his stepfather. Margaret paused. He knows about Bob, of course. I never hid that from him. But Bob left when David was 6. So Frank is really the only father he remembers. The conversation had taken on surreal quality, as if Claire were learning about the life of a character in a novel rather than her own father. The man Margaret described was simultaneously more complex and more human than the figure who had haunted Claire's childhood. But he was also more disappointing. He had loved multiple families, but had lacked the courage to fight for any of them. Mrs. Harrison Margaret, can I ask you something personal? At this point, I think we're past formalities. Do you think he ever really intended to come back? To any of us? Margaret considered the question seriously. I think Bob always intended to do the right thing. The problem was that he could never figure out what the right thing was. He was a good man, Claire, but he was also a weak one. He wanted to be everyone's hero, and he ended up being no one's. The judgment was delivered without malice, but it stung nonetheless. Claire had spent her life either hating her father for abandoning them or making excuses for his absence. The possibility that he had simply been inadequate to the complexities of his own life had never occurred to her. I should probably go, Claire said, though she wasn't sure she was ready to leave. This conversation had answered some questions, but raised dozens of others. You don't have to, Margaret said gently. I know this is a lot to process, and I know you probably have more questions. Claire looked at the photographs and documents still spread across the coffee table, evidence of a life she had never known existed. I do have more questions, but I think I need some time to figure out what they are. Margaret nodded understandingly. Claire, before you go, do you want to know what happened to him? To Bob? The question stopped Claire halfway to standing. You know what happened to him? I know he died. 5 years ago, in Montana, a man from the mining company called to ask if I knew about any other family. Apparently, Bob had listed me as his emergency contact, even after all these years. The news hit Claire like a physical blow. Her father was dead. Had been dead for 5 years while she continued to imagine him living somewhere, perhaps thinking occasionally about the daughter he had left behind. How? She managed to ask. Heart attack. He was alone, apparently. Never remarried, as far as I know. Margaret's voice was gentle. I'm sorry, Claire. I know this isn't how you probably wanted to find out. Claire sank back into her chair, trying to process this final piece of information. All her fantasies about confronting her father, about demanding explanations, or even just letting him know she had turned out all right, all of it was impossible now. There's something else, Margaret sighed quietly. Something I think you should know. Margaret disappeared into what Claire assumed was a bedroom, leaving her alone with the weight of everything she had just learned. Her father was dead, had been dead for 5 years. All the anger she had carried, all the questions she had planned to ask him someday, they were as pointless now as flowers on a grave that no one visited. She heard the sound of drawers opening and closing, then Margaret's footsteps returning. When the older woman reappeared, she was carrying a sealed envelope that looked official, the kind that banks or lawyers used for important documents. When the man from the mining company called about Bob's death, he told me there was a will, Margaret said, settling back into her chair. Nothing fancy, just a simple document he'd had drawn up locally. But he'd left instructions that if anything happened to him, I was to be contacted first, and I was to... She paused, holding the envelope carefully. I was to find his children and give them this. Claire stared at the envelope as if it might contain something dangerous. His children, plural. You and David, and apparently your children too. Emma and Jake, right? He knew their names, Claire. Somehow, he'd kept track of all of you. The revelation that her father had monitored their lives from afar was simultaneously comforting and unsettling. How had he known about Emma and Jake? Had he been closer than any of them realized? Margaret held out the envelope. I've been carrying this for 5 years, waiting for someone to come looking. I couldn't bring myself to track you down. What right did I have to intrude on your life with news about a man who'd abandoned you? But I couldn't throw it away either. Claire took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. Her name was written on the outside in her father's familiar handwriting. For Claire Matthews and her children, and for David Harrison and his family. Below that, in smaller print, to be opened only after my death, and only when you're ready to hear what I couldn't say while I was alive. Have you read it? Claire asked. Margaret shook her head. It wasn't meant for me. Though there's a separate letter for David and me in there too, I think. Bob was always thorough about things like that. Claire turned the envelope over in her hands, noting the care with which it had been sealed. Her father had planned for this moment, had anticipated that someday his children might come looking for answers. The thought that he had cared enough to prepare final words for them was almost more painful than his original abandonment. Margaret, before I open this, I need to know something. When he left for Montana, did you think he would come back? The older woman considered the question carefully. For a while, yes. Bob was good at making promises, and when he left, he swore he would get divorced and send for David and me within a year. I believed him because I wanted to, and because David was asking when Daddy was coming home. But he didn't. No. And after the first letter, there was nothing. I wrote to him several times, sent them to the mining company, but I never got another response. Eventually, I had to accept that he wasn't coming back, that maybe he had never really intended to come back. Claire thought about her own childhood, about the way she had trained herself to stop waiting for her father's return. How did you explain it to David? The same way your mother probably explained it to you. I told him that sometimes people leave because they think it's best for everyone, even when it isn't. Margaret's voice was soft with old pain. David stopped asking about Bob when he was about 8. By the time Frank and I married, he was ready to have a father who stayed for dinner every night. The envelope in Claire's hands felt heavier with each passing moment. Whatever her father had wanted to tell them, he had considered it important enough to entrust to a woman he had left behind, confident that she would honor his wishes even decades later. I should probably call Emma, Claire said. And Jake, if. This letter is meant for them too. Or you could read it first, Margaret suggested gently. Make sure it's something they need to hear. Some final words are meant for closure, but others just reopen wounds. Claire appreciated the wisdom in the suggestion. Emma and Jake had built their lives around the absence of a grandfather they had never known. If Robert Matthews' final letter was just an exercise in self-justification, or worse, a catalog of regrets that would burden them with guilt, perhaps it was better left unread. But as she looked at the envelope, Claire realized she was beyond the point of protecting anyone from difficult truths. The discovery of the chest in the woods had started a process that couldn't be stopped halfway through. I think I need to read it now, she said. While I'm here, where someone else knew him, Margaret nodded. I'll be right here if you need anything. Claire opened the envelope carefully, conscious that she was about to hear her father's voice for the first time in 50 years. Inside were several pages of legal-size paper covered in his careful handwriting, along with what appeared to be additional sealed envelopes marked with David's name and Margaret's. The letter was dated just 3 months before his death. My dear Claire, it began. If you are reading this, then you found the chest I buried near Miller's Creek, and you have been brave enough to follow the trail I left behind. I always hoped you would be the one to find it. You were always too curious and too smart to let sleeping dogs lie. Despite everything, Claire found herself smiling at the observation. Even as a child, she had been the one to investigate strange noises, to ask uncomfortable questions, to insist on understanding how things worked. I know that my leaving you and your mother was the defining wound of your childhood, and I know that nothing I write in this letter can undo the damage I caused by choosing cowardice over courage. But I hope that by the time you read this, you will have learned enough about my life after I left to understand that I didn't abandon you because I stopped loving you. I abandoned you because I loved you too much to keep hurting you with my presence. Claire paused, feeling tears threaten. The logic was twisted, but she could see the shape of her father's thinking, the same tendency toward self-sacrifice that had led him to support 2 families while claiming neither. I want you to know that not a single day passed in Montana that I didn't think about you. I knew when you graduated from high school because Mrs. Henderson sent me a copy of your photo from the local paper. I knew when you married Danny because the announcement was in the same paper. I knew when Emma and Jake were born because I paid a private investigator to send me updates every few years. I know this sounds like stalking, and maybe it was, but I needed to know that you were okay, that you were growing up strong despite my failures as a father. The revelation that Mrs. Henderson had been in contact with her father all these years was stunning. Their elderly neighbor, who had watched Claire grow up, who had offered gentle advice and practical help during the hardest times she had been secretly keeping Robert Matthews informed about his daughter's life. Claire looked up at Margaret. Did you know about Mrs. Henderson? Margaret shook her head. Bob never mentioned her, but it doesn't surprise me. He was always finding indirect ways to stay connected to people he thought he'd lost the right to contact directly. Claire returned to the letter, her hand shaking slightly. The hardest part about leaving wasn't giving up my life with you and your mother. The hardest part was realizing that I was hurting Margaret and David too by staying trapped between two worlds. I thought I could love everyone enough to make the impossible situation work. But all I did was guarantee that no one got enough of me to build a real life around. When I left for Montana, I told myself I was finally going to do the right thing, get divorced, marry Margaret, bring David to live with us as a real family. But once I got here, once I was truly alone for the first time in my adult life, I realized something terrible. I didn't know how to be a whole person. I had spent so many years dividing myself between different families that I had forgotten how to just be Robert Matthews, not somebody's husband or somebody's father or somebody's responsibility. Claire wiped her eyes, understanding for the first time the depth of her father's confusion. He hadn't just abandoned his families, he had abandoned himself. I need you to know that my decision to stay in Montana wasn't about choosing one family over another. It was about recognizing that I was poison to everyone I claimed to love. Margaret was better off with a man who could marry her legally and love her completely. David was better off with a father who came home every night instead of one who was always looking over his shoulder at the life he'd left behind. And you and your mother were better off without a man who brought nothing but complications and guilt to your kitchen table. But Claire, my dear daughter, I also need you to know that you were never the problem. You were the light of my life from the moment you were born. And if I could have figured out how to be the father you deserved without destroying everyone else I loved, I would have come home to you in a heartbeat. The words were like a balm on a wound Claire hadn't realized was still bleeding. All her life, she had wondered if there was something about her that had driven her father away, some fundamental inadequacy that had made her unworthy of his love. To learn that his leaving had been about his own limitations rather than her shortcomings was a relief so profound it left her breathless. There's more you need to know, the letter continued, and I'm hoping that Margaret will help you understand it. When I left for Montana, I was not a poor man. I had been saving money for years, putting aside everything I could spare after supporting both families. When I died, that money was still sitting in a bank account in Butte, Montana, because I never found anything worth spending it on. I've left instructions with my lawyer that the money should be divided equally among my children and grandchildren. Not because money can buy forgiveness, but because I want you all to have choices I never gave you. I want Emma to be able to finish her nursing degree without working 2 jobs. I want Jake to buy that house he's been saving for. I want David's children to go to college without student loans. And I want you, my brilliant daughter, to finally have the freedom to discover who you are when you're not just surviving. Claire's breath caught. Her father had left them money. Not just her, but all of them, including Emma and Jake, children he had never met but had apparently watched from afar, caring enough to provide for their futures. The lawyer's name is William Foster, and his office is in Butte. Margaret has his contact information. He's been waiting for someone from the family to contact him, and he'll explain how to claim what I've left behind. But Claire, before you do anything with that money, I need you to do something else first. I need you to find David, to meet your brother, and tell him that his father loved him even though he was too broken to show it properly. I need you to understand that my story isn't just about the man who left you. It's also about the man who left him. And if it's possible, if your heart is big enough after everything I've put you through, I need you to consider the possibility that we are all family. You and Emma and Jake, David and his children, even Margaret. We are all connected by the love of a man who was too damaged to love any of us well, but who loved us all the same. The letter continued for several more pages, containing specific messages for Emma and Jake. details about the inheritance, and instructions for contacting the latter in Montana. But the core message was clear. Robert Matthews had spent the last 30 years of his life trying to find a way to undo the damage he had caused by leaving. And this letter was his final attempt at redemption. When Claire finished reading, she looked up to find Margaret watching her with compassionate eyes. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked quietly. Claire wiped her tears and managed a shaky smile. "I think so. It's just he knew about Emma and Jake. He knew Jake wanted to buy a house. Knew Emma was working her way through school. How could he know so much and never reach out? Because he was ashamed," Margaret said simply. Bob carried guilt like a disease. The longer he stayed away, the harder it became to imagine coming back. After a while, I think he convinced himself that showing up would hurt everyone, more than staying gone. Claire looked at the additional envelopes her father had included in his final package. "These are for you and David?" Margaret nodded. "I suppose I should read mine now, too. And I should call David. Let him know that his biological father's other daughter is sitting in my living room." The phrase biological father's other daughter should have stung, but instead it filled Claire with an unexpected sense of connection. David was her half-brother, someone who had shared her experience of being left behind by Robert Matthews. Whatever pain her father had caused, it had created a bond between his children that might be stronger than blood. "Margaret," Claire said carefully, "would it be all right if I stayed while you called David? I think I'd like to meet him." Asterisk. The phone call to David was awkward from the moment Margaret dialed his number. Claire could hear only one side of the conversation, but David's confusion and skepticism came through clearly in the long pauses and Margaret's increasingly patient explanations. "Yes, David. I know it sounds impossible," Margaret was saying, "but she's sitting right here in my living room, and she has letters that Bob wrote to me 50 years ago. She looks exactly like him, honey. Same stubborn jawline, same way of tilting her head when she's thinking." Another pause, longer this time, during which Claire could hear the faint sound of David's voice growing more animated. "No, she doesn't want money. And no, I don't think she's running some kind of con. David, your father had another family before us. A wife and a daughter. I know I never told you the whole story, but," Margaret's voice grew gentle, "but maybe it's time you heard it." Claire watched Margaret's face as she listened to David's response, noting the mix of maternal concern and old pain that crossed her features. Whatever David was saying, it was clear that the news of Claire's existence was challenging some fundamental assumptions about his childhood. "Can you come over today? I think you two should meet, and there are some things your father left that you need to see." When Margaret hung up, she looked drained. "He's coming, but he's not happy about it. David has always been protective of our family's version of the story. Learning that there's another version as well, it's a lot to process." "What did you tell him about our father when he was growing up?" Margaret sank back into her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 73 years. "I told him that Bob was a good man who had to leave for work and couldn't come back. When David got older and started asking harder questions, I told him that sometimes adults make choices that don't make sense to children, but that Bob had loved him very much." "You never told him about us?" "How could I? What would have been the point? Bob was gone. You and your mother were strangers to us, and David was building a life with Frank as his father. Why complicate that with information about a half-sister he would probably never meet?" Claire understood the logic, but she also felt a pang of loss for the relationship she and David might have had if they had known about each other sooner. Growing up as only children, both of them had missed the experience of sibling support during their father's absence. "What's he like?" "David?" Margaret's expression softened. "He's a good man. Steady, reliable, everything Bob wasn't. He teaches high school history, coaches baseball, has 3 kids who adore him. He's the kind of father Bob always wanted to be, but never figured out how to be. The description made Claire nervous. David sounded like someone who had successfully overcome his father's abandonment and built a stable, happy life. Her appearance might feel like an intrusion, a reminder of painful history that was better left undisturbed. 20 minutes later, the sound of a car in the driveway announced David's arrival. Claire positioned herself where she could see the front door, but not be immediately visible to someone entering. She wanted a moment to observe this half-brother before he observed her. The man who entered Margaret's house was tall and solid, with the kind of presence that suggested natural authority. His hair was graying at the temples, and he wore the slightly rumpled clothes of someone who had left work in a hurry. But it was his face that stopped Claire's breath. He looked like their father, but softer somehow, as if Robert Matthews' features had been gentled by a lifetime of being loved consistently. "Mom," David called, using the title that confirmed Frank Harrison had been the father who mattered. "Where's this mysterious woman who claims to be related to us?" Margaret gestured toward Claire, who stood slowly, her hands damp with nervous perspiration. "David, this is Claire Matthews." "Claire, this is your brother David." The silence that followed was profound. David stared at Claire with an expression that cycled through disbelief, recognition, and something that might have been resentment. Claire found herself cataloging their similarities. They had the same hands, the same way of standing with their weight slightly forward, the same tendency to furrow their brows when concentrating. "You really are his daughter," David said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "So are you his son," Claire replied. David moved further into the room but didn't sit down, as if keeping his options open for a quick exit. "Mom says you found letters. Proof that Bob had another family." The skepticism in his voice was clear, and Claire couldn't blame him for it. She pulled out the manila folder containing her father's letters and photographs, spreading them on the coffee table as Margaret had done earlier. "These were buried in a chest in the woods near my childhood home," she explained, along with his wallet, some photographs, and other personal items. David approached the table warily, as if the documents might bite him. When he saw the photograph of their father with Margaret and young David at the mill picnic, his face went completely white. "I remember this day," he said quietly. "I remember him lifting me onto his shoulders, buying me cotton candy. I remember thinking he was the best dad in the world." "He loved you," Claire said, feeling the truth of it even as the words hurt to speak. The letters make that very clear. David picked up one of the letters, scanning it quickly. As he read, his expression grew more complex sadness, mixing with anger, understanding battling with old hurt. "He talks about you here," David said, looking up at Claire, "about not wanting to confuse you by having another family. But he was already confusing me by being a part-time father who disappeared for days at a time. He was sending money to both families," Claire offered, "trying to support everyone." "Money," David's voice turned bitter. "That's supposed to make up for missing baseball games and school plays? For leaving my mother to raise me alone while he played house with his real family?" The accusation hit Claire like a slap. "We weren't his real family. He left us too. He left all of us. But he went back to you first," David shot back. "When he had to choose, he chose his legal family over us." Claire stared at him, realizing that David's understanding of their father's departure was as incomplete as hers had been. "David, he didn't go back to us. He left my mother and me in 1974 and never came back. I haven't seen him since I was 7 years old." David's certainty wavered. "That's not Mom said he left for work and couldn't come back." Margaret, who had been silent during the exchange, cleared her throat gently. "David, sit down. There are things about Bob's leaving that I never told you, because I thought it would be easier if you didn't know the whole truth." David reluctantly took a seat, but his posture remained defensive. "What kind of things?" Margaret pulled out the legal documents she had shown Claire earlier, the marriage certificate proving that Robert and Patricia Matthews had never divorced, the employment records showing the timeline of his various jobs. Bob never divorced Claire's mother, Margaret explained. All the years we were together, all the times I thought of myself as his wife, he was still legally married to Patricia. When the mill closed and he got the offer in Montana, I couldn't go with him because I wasn't really his wife at all. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. You mean you and Bob were never actually married? No, honey. I thought we would be someday, but Bob was always putting it off, saying he needed to take care of some legal complications first. I didn't understand what he meant until it was too late. David looked between Claire and Margaret, his worldview visibly shifting. So when he left both families. He left everyone, Claire confirmed. He went to Montana alone and stayed alone until he died 5 years ago. The news of their father's death hit David like it had hit Claire as a door closing on possibilities he hadn't realized he was still holding on to. He sat back in his chair, looking suddenly older. 5 years ago, he repeated. He's been dead for 5 years. Margaret handed him the envelope containing his father's final letter. There's more, David. He left letters for all of us, and he left something else too. David opened his letter with the same careful attention Claire had given to hers. She watched his face as he read, seeing emotions play across his features: surprise, anger, grief, and something that might have been relief. When he finished, he looked up at Margaret with tears in his eyes. He was watching us? All this time, he was keeping track of our lives? Apparently. He knew about your teaching job, your marriage to Susan, your children's names and ages. He knew Claire's children, too, knew about their struggles and achievements. David turned to Claire with a new expression, not exactly warmth, but not hostility either. Emma and Jake, those are your kids? Yes, Emma's 32, a nurse practitioner. Jake's 29, an electrician. They never knew they had an uncle. And my kids never knew they had an aunt. David was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. He left money for all of them? For kids he never met? Claire nodded. According to the letter, he'd been saving for years. He wanted to give everyone choices he felt he'd never had. David stood up and walked to Margaret's front window, staring out at the street where he had grown up. I used to fantasize about him coming back, he said quietly. Even after Mom married Frank, even after I started calling Frank Dad, I used to imagine Bob showing up at our door with explanations and apologies and promises to be the father. I remembered from those early years. I did the same thing, Claire admitted. I used to think that if I was good enough, smart enough, accomplished enough, maybe he'd hear about it somehow and decide to come home. David turned back to face her, but he never did. He just watched from far away and sent money to a lawyer and convinced himself that was love. The bitterness in his voice was familiar. Claire had carried the same anger for years. But reading their father's final letter had begun to shift her understanding of his choices, and she wanted to share that perspective with David. I think he was afraid, she said carefully. Afraid that showing up would hurt us more than staying away. He convinced himself that leaving was a sacrifice he was making for our benefit. That's a convenient way to rationalize abandonment. Maybe. But David, I spent 50 years angry at him for leaving, and it didn't bring him back or make my life better. Maybe it's time to try understanding him instead. David studied her face, and for a moment, she could see their father in his expression. The same careful consideration, the same tendency to weigh decisions heavily. You really think we should contact this lawyer? Claim whatever money he left? Claire had been wrestling with the same question. Part of her wanted to reject anything that came from her father, to maintain the independence she had fought so hard to build. But another part of her recognized that accepting his final gift might be a form of forgiveness, not just of him, but of herself for carrying anger that had never served any useful purpose. "I think we should consider it," she said. "Not because we need his money to validate his love, but because refusing it won't change anything about the past." Margaret, who had been listening to their exchange with the patient attention of someone who had waited years for this conversation, stood up and moved toward the kitchen. "I'm going to make some coffee," she announced. "You two have a lot to talk about, and it's going to take a while to sort through 50 years of misunderstanding." As Margaret busied herself with coffee preparations, Claire and David found themselves alone together for the first time. The silence stretched between them, not entirely comfortable, but not hostile either. "This is really strange," David said finally. "Which part?" "All of it. Finding out I have a sister. Learning that our father was still alive until 5 years ago. Discovering that he left money for grandchildren he never met." David shook his head. "This morning I was a guy with no siblings and a dead father who abandoned me when I was 6. Now I'm part of some extended family I never knew existed." Claire smiled despite herself. "I know the feeling. This morning I was an only child whose father walked out and never looked back. Now I have a brother and a whole other side of my family story." "Do you think—" David started, then stopped, looking uncertain. "Do I think what?" "Do you think we would have been friends if we'd grown up knowing about each other?" The question caught Claire off guard. She studied David's face, noting the intelligence in his eyes, the careful way he chose his words, the underlying kindness that even his anger couldn't entirely mask. "I think we would have helped each other," she said. "I think having a sibling who understood what it felt like to be left behind might have made both of us feel less alone." David nodded slowly. "I think you're right. And I think Bob knew that too. That's why he wanted us to find each other." Margaret returned with coffee and a plate of cookies, settling back into her chair with the satisfaction of someone who had finally discharged a long-held responsibility. "So," she said, looking between Claire and David, "what happens now?" Asterisk. The question hung in the air like smoke after a fire. What happens now? Claire found herself looking between David and Margaret. These two people who had suddenly become central to a story she was still learning to tell about herself. "I think," Claire said carefully, "we need to call Emma and Jake. They deserve to know they have an uncle, and they need to hear about the inheritance from me, not from some liar in Montana." David nodded, then hesitated. "I should probably tell Susan and the kids. This is going to be, well, it's going to be a lot for everyone to process." Margaret reached for a notepad from the side table, her movements deliberate and practical. "We should probably coordinate this carefully. 3 generations finding out about each other all at once. That's a recipe for confusion if we don't handle it thoughtfully." Claire appreciated Margaret's steady presence more than she could express. This woman who had every reason to resent Claire's intrusion into her peaceful life was instead helping to orchestrate a family reunion 50 years in the making. "What did you tell Susan about your biological father?" Claire asked David. "I mean, before today?" David rubbed his temples, a gesture that reminded Claire of Emma when she was working through a difficult problem. "The truth, mostly. That my mother had been involved with a man who left when I was young. That Frank adopted me and was the only father I really remembered. Susan knows I've always wondered about Bob, but we never actively looked for information. And your children? They know they have a grandfather on my side who died before they were born and a step-grandfather who raised me. It's not exactly complicated until today." David managed a rueful smile. "Now they're going to find out they have an aunt and 2 cousins they've never heard of." Claire pulled out her phone, staring at Emma's number on the screen. Her daughter was at work, probably in the middle of a busy shift at the clinic. This wasn't the kind of news that should be delivered over a hurried phone call between patients. "I think I should drive home," she said. "Have this conversation with Emma and Jake in person. Some things are too big for phone calls." "That's probably wise," Margaret agreed. "David, what about you? Will you tell your family tonight?" David looked uncertain. "I'm not sure. Part of me wants to process this more before I try to explain it to anyone else. But keeping secrets, that feels too much like what Bob did, you know?" The comparison was apt. Their father had spent his adult life managing competing truths, keeping parts of his story hidden from everyone who loved him. The weight of those secrets had ultimately destroyed his ability to be fully present for anyone. "Maybe we should meet again," Claire suggested. "All of us together with our families. Not right away. Give everyone time to absorb the initial shock, but soon, before the questions start feeling bigger than the answers." David considered this. "What would that look like? Emma and Jake meeting Susan and my kids? All of us sitting around a table trying to figure out how to be family? It would look messy and awkward and probably wonderful," Claire said with more confidence than she felt. "But at least it would be honest." Margaret smiled at this, the first genuine warmth Claire had seen from her all day. Bob would have liked that. He spent so much energy trying to keep everyone separate, trying to manage which parts of his life each person could see. "I think he would have appreciated watching all of you choose to come together." The conversation was interrupted by David's phone buzzing with a text message. He glanced at it, then looked up with a slightly panicked expression. "Susan wants to know why. I left school early and when I'll be home for dinner. She's making my favorite meal because she thinks I might be getting sick." He showed them the message, which was signed with several heart emojis. "How exactly do I respond to that?" Claire laughed, despite the emotional weight of the day. "You tell her you're fine, but you have some family news to share, and you'll be home soon. Family news that will completely rewrite her understanding of my background. Susan married you knowing you had questions about your biological father," Margaret pointed out. "If she's been with you this long, she can handle learning there are more answers than either of you expected." David typed a brief response, then looked back at Claire and Margaret. "There's something else we need to talk about. The lawyer in Montana, William Foster. Someone needs to contact him, and I think it should be both of us. Claire and me, I mean." As Bob's children, Claire had been dreading this conversation. The inheritance represented more than money. It was her father's final attempt to influence their lives, to provide solutions to problems he had created through his absence. "David, I need to be honest with you about something. I'm not sure I want his money." His eyebrows rose. "Why not?" "Because accepting it feels like letting him off the hook. Like saying his abandonment was okay because he made financial provision for it." Claire struggled to articulate feelings that were still forming. "I've spent my whole adult life learning to be independent, learning not to need anyone who might disappear. Taking money from a man who disappeared feels like going backward." David was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. "I understand that. But Claire, what if it's not about letting him off the hook? What if it's about taking back some control over the story?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, Bob made choices that affected all of our lives. He left us all struggling in different ways. You, with single motherhood and financial stress. Me with abandonment issues and questions about my identity. Our kids growing up without knowing half their family. We can't change any of that. But we can choose what to do with what he's offering now." Margaret nodded approvingly. "David's right. The money isn't Bob asking for forgiveness. It's Bob acknowledging that his choices had consequences for people he loved. What you do with it is entirely up to you." Claire thought about Emma working double shifts to pay for her nursing program, about Jake saving every penny toward a down payment on his first house. Her children had inherited their grandfather's abandonment in the form of financial struggles. and the fierce independence born from never being able to rely on anyone completely. "If we contact the lawyer," she said slowly, "what happens then? Do we have to decide immediately about the inheritance?" "I doubt it," David replied. "Estate lawyers are used to families needing time to process unexpected windfalls. We can probably get information about what's involved without committing to anything." Margaret stood up and disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a small address book that looked like it had been well used over the years. "I have William Foster's contact information here. Bob gave it to me when he sent his final letter, along with a reference number for his estate." She copied the information onto a piece of paper, her handwriting neat and careful. "The reference number is important. Apparently, Bob set up the estate under an assumed name to maintain privacy." Claire stared at the lawyer's contact information, recognizing it as another threshold. Calling William Foster would make everything official, would transform this emotional discovery into a legal process with paperwork and procedures and binding decisions. "We don't have to call today," David said, apparently reading her hesitation. "But I think we should call soon. If nothing else, this lawyer might have more information about Bob's life in Montana. Maybe answers to questions we don't even know. We have yet." The suggestion resonated with Claire. Throughout this entire process, each answer had revealed new questions. Each piece of information had recontextualized everything she thought she knew. If their father had lived alone in Montana for 30 years, if he had built some version of a life there, she wanted to understand what that had looked like. "Okay," she said, "but I want to talk to Emma and Jake first. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it as a family. All of us." David smiled, and for the first time, Claire could see genuine warmth in his expression. "I'd like that. Susan and I have been talking about taking the kids to meet their East Coast relatives, my biological family, I mean. Maybe this is the universe telling us it's time." Margaret gathered up the papers and photographs they had been examining, handling them with the care of someone who understood their value. "I have an idea," she said. "Why don't you both take some time to have these conversations with your families? And then we'll plan a proper meeting. Here, or at Claire's place, or somewhere neutral. Give everyone a chance to ask questions and get to know each other before we start dealing with lawyers and inheritances." "That sounds perfect," Claire agreed. "Maybe next weekend?" That would give everyone time to adjust to the news. And time for me to figure out how to explain to my 12-year-old son that the grandfather he thought was dead actually lived until he was 7. David added with a grimace. "Children are more resilient than we think," Margaret said gently. "And they're usually more accepting of complicated family situations than adults are. Your kids might surprise you with how easily they adapt to having new relatives." As they began to gather their belongings and prepare to leave, Claire realized that the day had fundamentally changed, not just her understanding of her family, but her understanding of herself. She was no longer the only child of an abandoned woman. She was part of a larger story, connected to people who shared her history and might, with time and effort, share her future. "Margaret," she said as they prepared to leave, "thank you for keeping Dad's secrets all these years, for waiting for us to find you, for helping us figure out how to move forward. You didn't have to do any of this." The older woman's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "Oh, honey, yes, I did. I've been carrying this story for 50 years, and it's been heavy the whole time. Sharing it with the people it belongs to, that's not a burden, that's a relief." David hugged Margaret goodbye, holding her a moment longer than necessary. "Mom, I hope you know that none of this changes how I feel about you and Frank. You're still my parents, the ones who raised me and loved me and showed me how to be a good man." "I know, sweetheart. And I hope you know that Bob would be proud of the man you became, even though he missed most of the becoming." As Claire and David walked to their cars, They paused at the end of Margaret's driveway, both seeming reluctant to end this strange, transformative day. "Claire," David said, "I'm glad you found that chest. I'm glad you were brave enough to follow the trail. I'm glad too. And David, I'm glad our father loved badly rather than not at all. At least we know the capacity was there, even if he couldn't. Figure out how to use it." David nodded, understanding passing between them without need for further words. They were siblings now, connected by shared history and shared hurt, but also by the possibility of shared healing. As Claire drove home, she rehearsed different ways to tell Emma and Jake about their Uncle David, their step-grandmother Margaret, and the grandfather who had watched them from afar their entire lives. None of the conversations she imagined were easy, but all of them felt necessary. The truth was finally coming to light. And while it was more complicated than any story she might have invented, it was also more hopeful. Her father hadn't been a man who simply walked away from love. He had been a man who loved too much and too poorly, who had spent 30 years trying to find a way back to the people he had hurt. That didn't excuse his choices, but it did make them human. And perhaps, Claire thought as she pulled into her driveway, being human was the most any of them could hope to be. The phone call with Emma had gone better than Claire expected. After the initial shock and the inevitable questions about why Claire had kept the discovery secret for a week, Emma's curiosity had taken over. She wanted to see the letters, meet David, understand how their grandfather had known about her nursing program. Jake's reaction had been more guarded. He had always been the family skeptic, the one who questioned motives and looked for hidden costs in unexpected gifts. "So, let me get this straight," Jake had said during their three-way call. "This guy abandons you when you're 7, disappears for 50 years, and now we're supposed to care that he left us money and had another family we never knew about." "It's more complicated than that," Claire had tried to explain. "Is it? Because it sounds pretty simple to me. He made his choices, and now he's dead. Why should we rearrange our lives to deal with his leftover guilt?" Emma had been gentler, but equally direct. "Mom, what do you want from this? I mean, what's the best case scenario here?" The question had kept Claire awake for 2 nights. What did she want? Meeting Margaret and David had answered some questions, but raised others. The inheritance felt both like a gift and a burden. The possibility of extended family was appealing, but it also required emotional energy she wasn't sure she possessed. Now, standing in Margaret's living room on a Saturday afternoon, watching her grown children meet their uncle for the first time, Claire was beginning to understand what she wanted. She wanted her family story to have a different ending than the one Robert Matthews had written. David's family had arrived first, his wife Susan, a warm woman with laugh lines and the practical demeanor of someone used to managing teenagers, and their 3 children, Michael, 16, Sarah, 14, and Tommy, 12. They had clustered on one side of Margaret's expanded living room, the children polite but clearly uncertain about the purpose of this gathering. Emma had driven down from Portland with her 2 children, Lily, 8, and Ben, 6, both of whom were treating the afternoon like an adventure. Jake had come alone. His girlfriend was working, and he remained skeptical about the entire enterprise. Margaret had transformed her home for the occasion, moving furniture to accommodate the crowd and setting up a buffet of sandwiches and cookies that gave everyone something to do with their hands during awkward moments. She moved through the group with the grace of someone who had spent years managing family gatherings, making introductions and offering drinks with just enough warmth to put people at ease, without overwhelming them. "This is surreal," Susan murmured to Claire as they watched their children eye each other with the wariness of animals meeting for the first time. 3 days ago, David didn't know you existed. Now our kids are meeting cousins they never knew. They had. Claire nodded, understanding the feeling. How are you handling it? Learning that David's family history was more complicated than you thought? Susan considered the question carefully. Honestly, I'm relieved. David has spent our entire marriage wondering about his biological father, creating stories to fill in the gaps. Learning that Bob was flawed but not evil, that feels better than not knowing. Across the room, David was showing Jake and Emma the mill photographs, pointing out their father in the group shots. Jake studied the images with the intense focus he brought to electrical schematics, as if he could decode their father's motivations by examining his posture in 50-year-old photographs. He looks happy here, Emma observed, her nurse's training, making her naturally attentive to the subtle signs of people's emotional states. He was, I think, David replied, at least in those moments. Margaret says he was good at being present when he was there. The problem was that he was always leaving. Jake looked up from the photographs. So he was a part-time father to both families. That's not better, David. That's just differently disappointing. The bluntness of Jake's statement created a moment of silence that could have been uncomfortable, but David surprised everyone by laughing. You're right, he said. It is differently disappointing. But you know what? I'd rather be disappointed by the truth than confused by mysteries I'll never solve. Tommy, David's youngest, had been listening to the adult conversation with the intense attention the 12-year-olds brought to family drama. Dad, he said suddenly, if Bob was your father and Claire is Bob's daughter, does that make Claire our aunt? The question, delivered with the matter-of-fact logic of childhood, cut through the philosophical complexity the adults had been wrestling with. David smiled at his son. Yes, Tommy, Claire is your aunt, and Emma and Jake are your cousins. Tommy turned to Claire with the directness that adults had trained themselves out of. Are you going to come to our baseball games now? Because real aunts come to baseball games. The question caught Claire completely off guard. In all her processing of family relationships and inherited guilt, she hadn't considered the practical implications of suddenly becoming an aunt to 3 children who were strangers to her. She began, then looked at David and Susan. I'd like to, if that's okay with your parents. It's more than okay, Susan said warmly. We've been telling the kids for years that they don't have enough relatives. Now suddenly they have an abundance. Margaret, who had been quietly managing the logistics of feeding 9 people in her small living room, cleared her throat gently. If everyone's had enough to eat, maybe we should talk about the elephant in the room. Claire knew she meant the inheritance, the legal complications that had brought them together, but hadn't yet been directly addressed. In the weeks since learning about William Foster and the estate in Montana, both she and David had been focused on the emotional aspects of their discovery. The practical decisions couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Has anyone contacted the lawyer yet? Emma asked, characteristically cutting to the heart of the matter. Not yet, David replied. We wanted to have this conversation first. Figure out what we want as a family before we start dealing with legal procedures. Jake, who had been uncharacteristically quiet for most of the afternoon, leaned forward in his chair. Can I ask something that might sound mercenary? Go ahead, Claire encouraged. How much money are we talking about? Because if it's a few $1,000s, that's one conversation. If it's enough to change people's lives, that's a completely different conversation. It was a fair question, and one that Claire realized she had been avoiding. The inheritance represented her father's attempt to provide for people he had never really known, but it also represented choices that would affect her children's futures. David pulled out the paperwork Margaret had given him. According to Bob's letter, he'd been saving money for 30 years. The lawyer's contact information suggests it's managed by a firm that specializes in significant estates. Define significant, Jake pressed. I think, Margaret said carefully, that you should probably contact William Foster before speculating. But Bob was a frugal man who lived alone for 3 decades and had steady work. Whatever he saved, he didn't spend any of it on himself. Susan looked between David and Claire. What's the process? Do you both have to agree on what to do with it? Claire had been wondering about the same thing. I think the first step is finding out what's actually involved. What kind of money we're talking about, what the legal requirements are, whether we can make different choices about our portions. You're thinking about refusing it, Emma said. It wasn't a question. I'm thinking about a lot of things. Part of me wants to take the money and use it exactly the way Dad suggested. Help you finish school without debt. Help Jake buy his house. Give all of you choices he felt he never had. But another part of me feels like accepting it means agreeing. That money can substitute for presents. David nodded. I've been struggling with the same thing. But I keep coming back to what I told you before. This isn't about Bob asking for forgiveness. This is about Bob acknowledging consequences. Tommy, who had been following the conversation with the intensity that children brought to discussions about money, raised his hand like he was in school. Can I say something? Susan smiled at her son's formality. Of course, honey. I think if somebody wants to give you money to help with college and stuff, you should probably take it. Even if they weren't a very good grandfather. Because refusing to take it doesn't bring him back to life to be better. But taking it might help you do stuff you want to do. The logic was unassailable, delivered with the clarity that came from not being burdened by adult complications about pride and symbolism. Claire found herself smiling at this boy who was somehow her nephew. This child who could cut through emotional complexity with practical wisdom. Tommy makes a good point, she said. Maybe the question isn't whether we deserve the money or whether Dad deserves to have his final gesture accepted. Maybe the question is what we can do with it that would honor the people we've become despite his absence. Margaret, who had been listening to the conversation with the satisfaction of someone watching a long-held hope come to fruition, stood up and moved toward her desk. There's one more thing you should probably know before you make any decisions. She returned with another envelope, this one bearing the return address of William Foster's law firm in Montana. This arrived yesterday. I think it's from the lawyer. Asterisk. The envelope from William Foster's law firm seemed to pulse with significance as Margaret handed it to Claire. Everyone in the room had fallen silent, even the children sensing that another revelation was about to reshape their understanding of the day. Should I? Claire began, looking between David and Margaret. Open it, David said. Whatever it says, we're all in this together now. Claire carefully opened the envelope, noting the law firm's letterhead and the formal tone of official correspondence. As she read, her expression changed, cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been relief. What does it say? Emma asked when the silence stretched too long. Claire looked up at the group, her children, David's family, Margaret, all of these people who had become connected through the complicated legacy of one man's choices. Mr. Foster wants to schedule a conference call with all of Robert Matthews' children and their families. She read aloud. He says there are aspects of the estate that require explanation, and that my father left specific instructions about how information should be shared. David frowned. What kind of aspects? Claire continued reading. It says that the estate is more complex than a simple inheritance, and that there are documents and recordings that Dad wanted his families to see together. He's suggesting a video conference for next weekend, or he's willing to travel here. If we prefer to meet in person. Recordings? Susan asked. What kind of recordings? It doesn't say. Claire folded the letter carefully. But it sounds like Dad left more than just money. It sounds like he left explanations. Jake, who had been skeptical about the entire process, leaned forward with renewed interest. A video will? Did people do that in Montana? Margaret nodded slowly. Bob was always thorough about documentation. When we were together, he kept meticulous records of everything: bills, correspondence, Even conversations he thought might be important later. If he made a video before he died, it would be like him to want to control exactly how we receive the information. The idea of seeing and hearing their father again, even recorded and from beyond the grave, sent a ripple of mixed emotions through the room. Claire found herself both dreading and anticipating the possibility of witnessing Robert Matthews attempt to explain 30 years of silence. Do we want to do this? David asked the room in general. I mean, are we ready to hear what he has to say? Tommy raised his hand again, still operating under the assumption that family meetings follow classroom rules. If we don't listen to the recording, will we still get the money? His mother gently lowered his hand. Tommy, that's not the most important consideration. But it's a reasonable question, Jake said. Are we required to participate in some kind of posthumous therapy session in order to access the inheritance? Claire read through the letter again, looking for clues about legal requirements. Mr. Foster doesn't say it's mandatory, but he does say that the estate distribution is designed around Dad's specific wishes for how we should receive the information. Emma, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. I want to hear it. I want to know what he thought he couldn't tell us while he was alive. Even if it's painful? Claire asked. Especially if it's painful. Mom, we've spent our whole lives making up stories about why he left. Don't we deserve to know his version? David looked to his wife, then to his children. Michael and Sarah, the teenagers, seemed intrigued by the drama of it all. Tommy was focused on the practical implications. Susan nodded encouragingly. I think Emma's right, David said. We've come this far. We might as well hear what he has to say. Margaret gathered up the empty coffee cups, her movements suggesting someone who had made a decision. If you're going to do this, you should do it here. This is where Bob's two families first met, where his secrets finally came to light. It seems appropriate that this is where you should hear his final attempt to explain himself. The logic felt right to Claire. Margaret's living room had become the place where Robert Matthews' fractured story was being reassembled. Hearing his final words here, surrounded by the people his choices had affected, would provide a symmetry that appealed to her sense of completion. Okay, she said, reaching for her phone. I'll call Mr. Foster and schedule the video conference for next weekend. Wait, Jake said, holding up a hand. Before we commit to this, shouldn't we talk about what we're hoping to get out of it? I mean, what would he have to say that would change anything about how we feel? It was a fair question, and one that Claire realized she hadn't fully considered. What was she hoping to hear from her father? An apology? An explanation that would make sense of his choices? Permission to forgive him? I don't think it's about changing how we feel, she said slowly. I think it's about understanding how he felt. For 50 years, I've been angry at a man I didn't really know. Maybe it's time to be angry at the man he actually was instead of the monster I created in my imagination. David nodded. And maybe it's time for our kids to understand that family stories are complicated, that people can love badly without loving less. Susan looked at her children, her expression thoughtful. Kids, how do you feel about this? About hearing from your biological grandfather? Michael, 16 and old enough to understand the weight of the situation, shrugged with the studied nonchalance of teenagers. I mean, it's weird, but it's also kind of cool. How many people get to hear their dead grandfather explain why he made the choices he made? Sarah was more direct. Will it be sad? Because I don't like it when adults cry during family meetings. The honesty of the question made Claire smile. It might be sad, honey. Learning about people's lives sometimes is. But it might also help us understand things that have been confusing for a long time. Tommy, practical as always, had a different concern. If we watch the video, do we have to forgive him? Because Dad says you don't have to forgive people just because they're dead. David's expression showed pride in his son's moral reasoning. No, buddy. Listening to someone explain their choices doesn't mean you have to agree with them or forgive them. It just means you have more information. Claire felt a wave of affection for this nephew she was still getting to know. Tommy's questions were helping all of them think more clearly about what they were agreeing to undertake. Mr. Foster's letter says the video conference would include document sharing, she noted. So there might be written materials as well as recordings. Margaret returned from the kitchen, having given the family time to process the decision privately. Had you reached a consensus? I think so, Claire said, looking around the room and seeing nods of agreement. We're going to do it. All of us together next weekend. Good, Margaret said with satisfaction. Bob would have liked that all of his children and grandchildren finally hearing his story at the same time, without secrets or separate versions. As the afternoon wound down and families began the process of saying goodbye and making plans for the following weekend, Claire found herself watching the interactions between her newly expanded family. Emma was exchanging phone numbers with Susan, making plans to bring the kids together for a playdate. Jake was talking to Michael about college plans, offering advice about electrical engineering programs. Tommy had appointed himself the official keeper of family logistics, asking everyone for their email addresses so he could send them reminders about the video conference. David walked Claire to her car as the others gathered belongings and prepared to leave. No second thoughts? He asked. Plenty of second thoughts, Claire admitted, but no desire to change course. What about you? Same. I keep thinking about what you said, about being angry at the man he actually was instead of the one we imagined. I'm ready for that. They stood beside her car for a moment. Two middle-aged people who had spent their lives as only children and were still adjusting to the idea of having a sibling. David, Claire said, regardless of what we learn next weekend, regardless of what we decide about the inheritance, I'm glad we found each other. Me too. And Claire, I think we're going to be okay. All of us. Whatever Bob says in that recording, whatever complicated emotions it brings up, we're stronger together than any of us were alone. As Claire drove home, she reflected on the strange journey that had begun with a buried chest and was now leading toward a conversation with a dead man who had spent 30 years preparing his final words. The story wasn't over yet. It might never be completely over, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was moving toward understanding rather than away from it. Next weekend, she would finally hear her father's voice again. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. 6 months after that first video conference with William Foster, Claire walked a familiar forest trail with a different understanding of what it meant to carry family history. The walking stick in her hand had been carved by David from a piece of driftwood they'd found together during the family reunion they'd organized for Memorial Day weekend. It was smooth now from daily use, marked with the small nicks and scratches that came from regular companionship. The video call had been everything she'd expected and nothing she'd prepared for. Robert Matthews, recorded just 3 weeks before. His death had looked older than she'd imagined, but more at peace than she'd dared hope. He had spent 2 hours methodically working through his story, explaining his choices with the careful precision of someone who had spent years thinking about what he wanted to say. The inheritance had been larger than any of them expected. Large enough to change lives, to open possibilities that had been closed by financial necessity. Emma had been able to quit her second job and focus on completing her nurse practitioner certification. Jake had bought his house, a small craftsman bungalow with a workshop where he was teaching Tommy to build furniture on the weekends they spent together. David's children would attend college debt-free, a gift that had reduced Susan to tears during the lawyer's explanation of the trust fund provisions. But more than the money, Robert Matthews had left them something else. The gift of his complete story, unedited and unvarnished. He had talked about his love for both families, his guilt over causing pain to people he cherished, and his ultimate recognition that staying away had been cowardice disguised as sacrifice. He had apologized, not for leaving, which he still believed had been necessary, but for staying away so long that leaving became permanent. "I convinced myself that you were all better off without me," he had said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that Claire finally recognized as her own. "But I think the truth is that I was scared you would reject me if I tried to come back, and I chose the certainty of absence over the risk of rejection." The honesty had been devastating and healing in equal measure. Claire had cried. David had cried. Even Jake had wiped his eyes during their father's explanation of how he had tracked their achievements from afar, celebrating their successes and worrying about their struggles while maintaining the distance he had convinced himself was kindness. Now, walking the trail where it had all begun, Claire carried her father's story differently. The anger hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something more complex, a recognition of human limitation, of the gap between intention and capability that defined so much of life. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "The community center is approved. Construction starts in the fall. Still can't believe we're really doing this." The Millbrook Family Resource Center had been Claire's idea, her way of using her portion of the inheritance to address the struggles she had lived through as a single mother. It would offer childcare, job training, financial counseling, and support groups, all the services that might have changed her life 30 years ago. Emma was going to run the health clinic component, using her new credentials to provide accessible health care to families who couldn't afford traditional medical care. Margaret had become the project's unofficial coordinator, bringing her decades of community involvement and her gift for practical organization to the planning process. She had also become something Claire had never expected to have at 57, a mother figure who understood her history and chose to love her anyway. The sound of voices on the trail ahead made Claire look up. David and Tommy were approaching, both carrying fishing poles and wearing the slightly sheepish expressions of people who had spent more time talking than fishing. "Any luck?" Claire called out as they drew near. "Depends on how you define luck," David replied. "No fish, but Tommy has decided he wants to become a forest ranger when he grows up." Tommy, now 13 and full of the earnest enthusiasm that made him everyone's favorite nephew, grinned at Claire. "Aunt Claire, did you know there are over 40 species of trees in this forest, and some of them are more than 200 years old?" The title, Aunt Claire, had become natural over the months, worn smooth by repetition and genuine affection. Claire's house had become a regular stop for David's family during their weekend adventures, and she had discovered the particular joy of being the adult who could spoil children and then send them home to their parents. "I did not know that," Claire said solemnly. "That's older than our entire family's history in this area." "That's what I told him," David said. Trees put family drama in perspective. They walked together toward the parking area, the easy companionship of people who had chosen to build relationships despite complicated beginnings. Tommy chattered about forest management and conservation, while David and Claire caught up on the week's developments in their respective projects. "Susan wants to know if you're still planning to come to Sarah's graduation next month," David said. "She's been working on her speech, and she specifically wants to thank her Aunt Claire for showing her that family can expand at any age." The invitation touched Claire more than she could express. Sarah, now 15 and as thoughtful as her younger brother was enthusiastic, had become a regular correspondent, sending Claire texts about school projects and friend drama with the casual assumption that aunts were people you could talk to about anything. "I wouldn't miss it," Claire said. "Jake and I are driving up together. He wants to see Tommy's latest woodworking project." The relationships that had developed between her children and David's had been one of the unexpected gifts of their expanded family. Jake, who had been the most skeptical about the entire process, had become particularly close to Michael, bonding over shared interests in building and design. Emma treated David's children like the younger siblings she had never had, dispensing advice and support with the authority of someone who had navigated the complexities of growing up in a single-parent household. As they reached the parking lot, Claire noticed a familiar figure sitting on one of the picnic tables near the trailhead. Mrs. Henderson, now 82 and still walking her daily routes, waved at them with the satisfaction of someone whose secrets had finally been revealed to good purpose. "Grace!" Claire called out, using the first name she had only recently learned she was allowed to use. "How was your walk?" "Educational as always," Mrs. Henderson replied, climbing down from the picnic table with the careful dignity of advanced age. "Though I have to say, I like these family walks much better than the solitary ones you used to take." It had taken Claire months to work through her feelings about Mrs. Henderson's role in her father's surveillance, but she had eventually come to understand that their elderly neighbor had been motivated by the same love that had driven Robert Matthews. More misguided choices. Mrs. Henderson had watched over Claire's family with the protective attention of someone who cared about their well-being, even when that care had to be expressed indirectly. "We like them better too," David said, helping Mrs. Henderson gather her walking gear. "Can we give you a ride home?" "That would be lovely, thank you." As they prepared to leave, Claire took one last look at the trail that had led to so much discovery. The chest was long gone, its contents distributed among family members who were building new stories with old information. But the forest remained, patient and enduring, holding space for whatever revelations might still be buried beneath its protective canopy. Tommy, who had been unusually quiet during the walk back, suddenly spoke up. "Aunt Claire, do you think Bob would be happy about how everything turned out?" The question was vintage Tommy, direct, thoughtful, and focused on the emotional core of complicated situations. Claire considered it seriously, thinking about the man she had learned her father to be rather than the one she had imagined. "I think he would be amazed," she said finally. "I think he would be proud of who we all became, and surprised that we chose to become family with each other despite his mistakes." "Good," Tommy said with satisfaction, "because I like having a big family, even if it's complicated." David smiled at his son, then at Claire. "Complicated families are the best kind. They give you more people to love and more stories to tell." As they drove toward town, Claire reflected on the truth of that observation. Her family was indeed complicated now, an intricate web of relationships that required effort to maintain, but rewarded that effort with richness and depth. Emma's children had grandparents they called Grandma Margaret and Grandpa Frank, and cousins who taught them about different ways of being in the world. Claire herself had become part of a larger story, connected to people who shared her history and were helping her write its future chapters. The community center construction site came into view as they drove through downtown, marked by signs announcing the project and listing the major donors. Robert Matthews' name was there, along with his children's and grandchildren's, a public acknowledgement of the family that had finally found each other across the gap of his absence. "He's part of it now," David observed, following Claire's gaze. "Not the way any of us would have chosen, but he's part of our story going forward instead of just being part of what we left behind." Claire nodded, understanding that this was perhaps the most she could ask for. Not redemption for her father's choices, but integration of those choices into a narrative that moved toward healing rather than perpetual hurt. As Mrs. Henderson had often said during the months of planning and building that followed their discovery, some stories take generations to resolve. Claire's father had begun a story he couldn't finish, had created complications he couldn't solve, had loved people he couldn't figure out how to keep. But his children and grandchildren were finishing the story differently, choosing connection over separation, transparency over secrets, forgiveness over perpetual anger. The walking stick David had carved for her had become a symbol of that choice. A tool for moving forward that was made from something beautiful that had been worn smooth by its journey through difficult waters. Claire carried it with her on every walk now, a reminder that the best way to honor complicated histories was to keep walking toward better futures. The afternoon sun was setting as they reached Margaret's house, painting the sky in shades of golden rose that reminded Claire of the October day when she had first discovered the chest that changed everything. But unlike that day, she was not walking alone. She was surrounded by family chosen and discovered, inherited and created, and the path ahead was marked not by buried secrets, but by shared hopes. As she prepared to head home to her small apartment, which now felt like a resting place rather than a refuge, Claire realized that her father's final gift had not been the money, substantial though it was. His final gift had been the courage to leave a complete story, messy and painful and human, that allowed his children to finally understand not just why he had left, but how much it had cost him to stay away. Some treasures, Claire had learned, were worth exactly what you paid for them, and some were worth even more than the price they extracted. The chest in the woods had cost her the comfortable distance of not knowing, but it had given her something infinitely more valuable, the possibility of belonging to a story larger than survival, richer than solitude, and more hopeful than she had ever dared to imagine. The forest would still be there tomorrow, patient and enduring, holding space for whatever other discoveries time might reveal. But Claire would walk those trails differently now, not as someone searching for something lost, but as someone who had found her way home to a family that chose to love across the complications of history and the mistakes of the past. The story. Her father had begun in abandonment. His children were ending in reunion, and that, Claire thought as she drove home through the gathering dusk, was perhaps the most any of them could ask from the complicated inheritance of being human.